in the tech.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, we are live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Orbit Live event with Kim Stanley Robinson and Lincoln Michel. Lincoln Michel is the author of the acclaimed short fiction collection Upright Beasts, and his debut novel, The Body Scout, will be published by Orbit later this month. Jonathan Lethem called The Body Scout fizzy and brilliant and said that he devoured it. Kim Stanley Robinson is a Malto Hugo Award winner, New York Times bestseller, and the author of many acclaimed science fiction novels. His latest is The Ministry for the Future, which was one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2020. The Ministry for the Future will be out in paperback next month. Michel and Robinson will be having a conversation about their books, but they'll also be answering your questions. Click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen to submit a question or to vote on your fellow attendees' questions. And if you're watching this event live, click on the green button at the bottom of the screen that says Buy Michel and Robinson's books to pre-order them if you haven't already. Signed copies of The Body Scout will be available through Powerhouse Arena through the fourth link at that page. Don't forget to subscribe to Orbit Live on Crowdcast to be notified about other upcoming events. And now I am very happy to turn it over to Lincoln and Stan.
Great. And thanks, everyone, for being here. I think we're supposed to remind you all to please ask us questions in the chat box in the bottom.
Yes. Yes. Good to meet you, Lincoln. It's a real pleasure. And I wanted to say congratulations on all of your publishing successes, including the new novel. But I also wanted to note and ask you, I just read today your new story in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I hear that you've also been published in the Paris Review. It's kind of an unusual combination, at least coming from my generation, and I just wanted to ask you about that and see how things have been going.
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you. Yeah, I do think that feels like something that to me has changed, maybe honestly, in even like only the last 5 to 10 years. I feel like there was much more of a kind of wall separating those two worlds, and these days, I certainly don't think I'm the first. You have writers like Carmen Maria Machado and Kelly Link and Brian Evanson and many others who kind of have been publishing in both of those kind of zones. But I'm very happy to be able to do that. I feel, very, very lucky to do that for sure. But it's been...
I like to see it. It's I come from a time when those walls were very high and very hard, and so I take an interest in and I'm very happy to see them coming down.
Well, I'm 100% on the side of kicking those walls down. I had a question for you too, and we'll remind everyone to please ask us your own questions in the box. I was reading a lot of, I read obviously your new book, The Ministry for the Future, and I was reading some interviews of you and about the book, and a lot of the interviewers talked about how you had kind of returned to climate change as a topic for the novel. And as I was reading those interviews, I was kind of, also reading the news about Greek islands on fire and, pandemics and wildfire smoke and the West Coast floating to New York. And I guess I wondered, can you imagine not writing about climate change for the foreseeable future? Is this, is science fiction now a genre about climate change in some sense?
I think it is, if you confine it to near future science fiction, because I think it's really obvious that science fiction breaks down into a great number of subgenres or categories, and a lot of them are chronological. So if you're writing science fiction set in the next century, how could you not get involved with climate change somehow or other? It's an overriding consideration. If you go out 2 or 3 centuries, you could maybe still be dealing with it, or maybe be writing about its aftermath or knock-on effects. If you go out 5 million years into the zone of space opera, then you're free to write about what you want and zip about the galaxy, and that's a very valid story space. So it really depends on where you're putting your chronological focus. I do think that climate change has kind of eaten near future science fiction, which maybe used to be about other things more often, computers or whatever economic concerns. You can see how the rise of, in 1950 science fiction, the kind of satire, the kind of absurdist and surrealist satire that you yourself are often deploying They're wondering about the relationship between, individual freedom and conformity of the times, the various 1950s worries. So climate change wasn't on the radar, but now it's kind of what can I say? It's it's there in our face, and it becomes the topic. Not always. I myself plan on writing another piece in both the immediate future of my next projects, and after that, in a way, I've kind of said my piece.
Mm.
So it's on to other topics, and I think that's perfectly valid. You're not obliged to stick to the headlines of your own time, especially when you're doing science fiction, but fiction in general. There's larger and more permanent concerns to talk about sometimes.
Yeah. Another question I had about the Ministry for the Future is, one of the things I really found really, fascinating about the book was the kind of structure you used. And I know that there's been a lot of talk about the kind of broad amount of voices, the kind of panoply of voices you use. But I was also related to that, but interested in the way that you mix up forms, right? That we have chapters that are kind of traditional fiction narrative, and then chapters that are monologues, sometimes from inanimate objects, and chapters that are read almost like essays even. And I was curious how you arrived at that kind of structure.
Well, I wanted it to be a global novel, and I also wanted to have some fun with it. And when you think about the topic of existential crisis, climate change, heat wave deaths, the notion of fun may sound perverse at first, but a novel is a novel, and it is there to entertain, as well as bring the news. And so the game of forms was really what I had there, to bounce around, to have a lot of short chapters and to have the reader not know what kind of thing would come up next when they were reading. Um, that I thought was was going to be one of the pleasures of the text, in a text that in its content might not have a whole lot of pleasures, although I did my best, as usual, to kind of inject some pleasure into the text. Now, turning that around, I see that The Body Scout is kind of your classic first-person detective novel, or maybe the Jimmy Stewart and Hitchcock, where the protagonist is forced to become the detective because it's been thrust on him by emergency. And I love that form. And I notice also, because of also just reading your short story this morning, that there's a really strong, what I would call economics component to your fiction, where your people are in trouble. They're in debt. Let's put it that way. They're in financial trouble. So this seems to me to be something that interests you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, the story that you're referring to in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction is kind of a satirical ghost story that becomes a story where the real horrors are capitalism, maybe.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was certainly part of it. The book, the novel that I wrote has a kind of cyberpunky vibe to a degree, but maybe in another sense, it's more of like a punk book, like without the cyber. I really grew up on like 1970s and 1980s punk rock, and got a lot of my politics from that, at least as a very young kid. And so there's real, I think, one of my drives is certainly just a kind of anti-corporate, fuck you, fuck the system kind of vibe. But yeah, it's certainly a concern. I mean, kind of like, not that I would compare it to climate change per se, but in terms of the kind of persistent things that depress me about the world, I log on Twitter every day and see my friends or strangers who are, running GoFundMe's to like pay for what should be basic medical treatments, or, pay for childbirth, things like that. And it's hard not to be like, this is messed up, right? This is something that is, causing a lot of problems, and also certainly ties into what is happening with climate change too. But yeah, so that's
It's funny because I just read, right before your novel, I read a long article on the Russian doping schemes for sports. So it clicked right into your book. And so even though yours might not be cyberpunk, it's cyborg punk. Or I mean, I renounce in all situations, which of course is getting me in trouble with my the crowd that is calling themselves solar punk. This suffix punk is sort of like scandals are always gate and movements are always punk. I truly dislike it. But let's go back to cyborgs. This is so interesting to me because I've got artificial parts in my body now keeping me alive, and a lot of people do. So we're all cyborgs already. So when you start writing about it going or running amok, and for various kinds of capitalist or entertainment or non-crucial causes, it's already happening, right? So you're able to push something that we're seeing out there in the world.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely think that, the kind of some of the impetus in my book was, let's take the things that I'm, seeing in the real world and just amplify them by a bit, exaggerate them, hyperbolize them or something through a science fiction lens. But yeah, we're all cyborgs or getting treatments, in a certain sense. And then we're already in a world. So in my novel, for the people who haven't read it, part of it involves this future in which the body is the kind of the marketplace of capitalism. So the rich can afford treatments that the poor can't. And that's also, of course, true today, which you can,
Yeah.
the distribution of COVID vaccines is a very obvious example of that.
Yeah. So now you're in New York, and typically the launch of a first novel for somebody in New York City, I mean, I can just imagine the potential events, especially given the spread of your short fiction and your career so far. So is that going to happen? Or is it been zoomed out by the pandemic, or how's that going to work for you?
Good question. I guess this is a good opportunity to plug that I do have an in-person launch event on the day my book comes out, which is the 21st at Powerhouse Arena in Brooklyn. So if anyone is from New York, they can come out. But that is the only one that I'm planning in person so far. But, on that topic, maybe it's time to switch to the audience questions. And we have, the first one is about that, which was about how we both have written books set in New York. And the question is, why did you or we pick New York? And what was the process of imagining the evolution of the city like?
Do you want to start on that while I marshal my thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I do live in New York, so that was a kind of obvious place for me to set it, perhaps. And yeah, I haven't really marshaled my thoughts there either. I guess I would say that for me, a lot of what I did in the book was this kind of hyperbolizing of what I see today in New York, and for this somewhat anti-corporate, anti-capitalist critique as well. So an example is, in my book, a lot of the poor people live in this subsidized housing, which is, they call it the boroughs, and it's literally like underground, which is, especially with the flooding these days, perhaps something that might not literally happen, but it's a kind of a hyperbolization of something that already happens in New York, where there'll be apartment buildings that get built and they have a kind of subsidized component. And the people who live in the subsidized portions sometimes have what is called a pour door, basically a separate entrance, so they don't mix with the richer condo owners. So that's a kind of example of what I was trying to do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for me, my New York novel, New York 2140, came as a result of a conversation with the great editor and publisher of Orbit Books, Tim Holman, whom I dearly love. And I told him I wanted to write a book about global finance one time over lunch. And he said, "Oh, that's a terrible idea, Stan." And about a half hour later, because it was a happy lunch celebrating something else, he said, if you were going to do global finance, surely it should be in New York. And remember, in 2312, you had this brief pass through of New York City where it was flooded like a Venice. Why don't you put it there? And I said, good idea, and ran with that. I myself am a Californian. I don't know anything about New York, really. My total time there is probably, I don't know, if you add all the visits together, it's maybe a month. Excuse me. A month at most. I'm just a visitor. I come for the publishing, and I'm a total hick when I'm in town. I walk around looking up at the skyscrapers, amazed. So I wrote from that angle, but what I found was that every American has an internalized New Yorker, nattering away, ranting away. We know the tropes, we know the accent, we've seen it all. because of the media. It's really it's so much the American city that it's like transcends America. It's like it's its own space that's dragging America around at an angle to it. It's different. It's a world city and maybe the greatest city on earth. So perfect for global finance since it's also home for global finance. So that was one of the many great things that Tim Holman has done for me was to prod me in that direction. And after that, I just took it on like a kind of an anthropologist, I guess. So there's so much of it in the literature that you can concoct it. And I had friends in the city. When I come to the city, I usually stay in Brooklyn. I have friends who show me around, who are real New Yorkers, who know places that I wouldn't even know to look for. Like, you got to see this, or you won't know what's going on. So that was a huge help, too.
Great. And I guess I should say that comment was from EB. And then we have another question from Lilium Rivera. And hi, Lilium. And she says, how do you write these futurist visions of the world that still hold some sort of hope for the future? Or maybe there is no hope.
Well, hope is inherent to it happens at the cellular level. So I have no problem talking about hope. Hunger is a kind of hope. Waking up and getting out of bed is a kind of a hope, that something will happen. So I think that's inherent in life. The two, you can define them as being almost the same thing. So, but really, then you need to deploy it as a political weapon. You have to pound on people. And also, geez, Louise, as a privileged American middle-class citizen, if that class were to lose hope, what does it mean for all the people who are really struggling, who are actually quite hopeful in their attempts to get to a better life? It would be a failure of nerve, a kind of a moral bullshit, a fashionable cynicism, a way of pretending not to hope when really you hope like crazy. So I have no patience for cynicism or pessimism. These are they're failures of nerve, really. You gotta face up to the fact that we're in a stupendously dangerous situation. That needs to be admitted right offhand, immediately. Okay, we're on the edge of a mass extinction event, and things could go so badly that all the dystopian novels are really not at all unrealistic. That all those bad things could surely happen, and even worse. Not zombies, just death and starvation. So, but starting from that, then you look at the possible solutions and fixes and workarounds. They're all out there. They're being worked on 24/7 by a cadre of people that I would estimate to be in the hundreds of millions, if not. You could maybe even say that 2 or 3 billion people are working every day to try to make the situation better. And then there's a few 100,000 in positions of extreme power who are actively working to make things worse. One would hope you could overrun them with numbers.
Yeah, I think, it's a really important question. I mean, I think my book, I don't know how hopeful it is about the future, although I also don't consider it dystopian per se, and that it seems to me more like, what is our present kind of exaggerated a bit. But I do think that hope is it's a useful thing in science fiction. It may be like part of the project of science fiction in the sense of showing different ways of thinking or different ways of living, different ways of society. I had another question I was going to ask you about this because I was thinking about how there's a quote in your novel from one of the characters talks about how it's easier to imagine the end of world than the end of capitalism, which is a reference to, the famous quote by a professor of yours, Frederick Jameson. And it also reminded me, though, of this Ursula K. Le Guin quote that she said at the National Book Awards when she won the kind of Distinguished Medal in 2014, where she said, "We live in capitalism. Its powers seem inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art," which I often think part of that is maybe like science fiction, especially as a place in which we need to show other ways of society and organization.
Yeah. Well, it's a great that you referenced and quoted Ursula's wonderful speech there. That was a barn burner. She clearly planned it carefully, a kind of culmination of her life's work as a science fiction writer. She acknowledged the science fiction community at the beginning of that thank you. So even though she was out there in the general literary community, she wanted to make sure that her roots in her hometown were acknowledged first, and then she kicked ass. It was beautiful to watch. And yeah, I do think she was pointing to the fact that science fiction being set in the future can set stories that indicate that there are ways forward beyond just despair and giving up. I mean, I don't want to do any spoilers for your book, but I saw in those last chapters that what you had was also a classic and beautiful. The guy persists, and the people he's working with that are on his side, um, even if they don't seem like it for a while, they also persist. So there's that kind of classic moment, the breakout. Things look dark, then they look darker, then they're completely dark. But if you persist, then there's that break, which I found was really a good one in your book. That was beautiful. And I hope that this is general enough. And also, I don't believe in spoilers anyway. At least
Yeah.
when talking about my book, go ahead and, people quote the last line in the book. I don't care. It's okay. That's not really what, I mean, plots are plots, but books are bigger than a plot.
I try not to stress about spoilers. And yeah, I would hope that there's that sense in the end. And I think I mentioned before that I kind of consider the book on some level like a punk book, and like the punk music I grew up listening to. Not that that is by any means the only or like major influence, but I was just thinking about that recently because I've done podcasts where people keep asking me about cyberpunk and solar punk and stuff, and I agree that suffix gets overused. But the punk music that I listened to had a lot of rage and despair, but also a lot of hope. Most of those bands would have a song about how horrible the system is, and the next one was like, go start a revolution. There's a sense of hope there too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially punk music, it was there. Why would you be making music if you didn't have that urge to create and to do something positive? So, I, I mean, this is going back into the archives, and it's maybe irrelevant except to my own personal story. But there were years in which I was the great antichrist to the cyberpunk crowd, and I would immediately want to say that doesn't include my my good friend acquaintance Bill Gibson, but there was a different crowd that was extremely hostile, and they seemed to, although they were middle class white guys just like me, they seemed to want to prove that they were tough guys, that they would have been out in the parking lot in leather jackets smoking cigarettes if they had thought to back in high school. But so this was an ugly stance, and it disfigured the internal history of science fiction for most of a decade. It was a stupid decade. It's long gone. But what it means for me is that when I hear punk stuff on the into something, I'm thinking, why don't we talk about utopia? So there's dystopia. Yeah, things are going to the dogs. But utopia, very slender strand in the literary world. There's never been very many of them. They're a little crazy. They often are clunky as hell. It's a difficult form at best, misbegotten, you might say. But you mentioned Le Guin. She was the great utopian science fiction writer and an example, uh, an exemplary figure, an inspiration really to all of us of my generation. She was really the big mama, like the big sister or the aunt that you could count on. I loved her dearly, and so she showed, especially in The Dispossessed, how a utopian science fiction novel could work and be good as a novel too. Well, this was like a blow to the head. I stayed up all one night reading that book, and it was amazing to have the realization that you didn't have to downgrade the fiction in order to make the politics more clearer or whatever. You could make both work. So I encourage all the there's now a solar punk magazine. There's Hope Punk. Every time I write to these people, I feel like a cranky old man, and I suppose that's very accurate. I am a cranky old man. I think, God damn it, just call it utopian science fiction and don't deny your roots here. And also don't cut yourself off from your roots, because movements are like plants. Once you cut the roots off, you don't thrive as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's very interesting to hear you talk about this as someone who is younger, so didn't live through those fights. So me, I read, Neuromancer alongside Ian Banks, who I know you also admire. And,
Yeah.
they didn't seem like at odds to me. I was happy to read them both.
Oh, of course. They're both very fine writers, stylish and admirable. And I don't know. I've run into Bill Gibson through the years many times, and I like him a lot, but I don't know him very well. Banks was a friend of mine, although ironically, of course, he was in Scotland, I was in California, but I stayed with him when I was in Scotland. He stayed with us when he was in the United States, which I must admit, after a while, he stopped doing. As a kind of political statement, I have to say, at a certain point, he cut up his passport and sold all of his fast cars. He was a lover of fast cars. And he bought a Prius and decided he would never fly again. And he was actually transforming himself into a kind of a green warrior when, unfortunately, he died. So, Banksy was a kind of a genius of a storyteller, Scotland's great writer for 20 years. And I still enjoy reading him. And he's a treasured figure in my mental space for sure, because he too was utopian. That Culture series,
Yeah.
Things are going well. There were problems. There were quite amazingly violent and spectacular problems, but nevertheless, there's a utopian cast of Banks that I treasure.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so to go back to the audience questions, one related to this is that Yash asks, what utopian works beyond Le Guin and perhaps beyond Bank now do you recommend? I want to read more.
Oh, hell yeah. Although I got to preface this by saying that I haven't read much for a long time. I've read some of my friends that I keep up with because they're my friends. And then I deliberately don't read a lot of science fiction so that I don't scare myself with how weird I might be. If I knew how weird I was, I might try to be more normal. So it's best not to know. So in a way, I'm existing in relative ignorance from the current state of the scene, which is so huge and various. I don't think anybody could keep up with it anyway, even if they tried to. And I haven't tried. In fact, I've avoided it. But I'll say this. Cory Doctorow is a great writer. He's teaching us a lot. He's a utopian science fiction writer, but also a great scholar of the current internet scene and the legalities. And as an anti-capitalist, working for open source and sort of the liberation of people from corporations, I think Cory Doctorow is an essential figure. And I like, someone who blurbed you, I love his books exceedingly. Jonathan Lethem, another New Yorker, and another friend. I know these people pretty well, and that's one of the reasons I read them, but also just for pleasure. Lethem is a stylish and super inventive novelist, a great power. I also am really happy for the Science Fiction Writers America's Grand Master Award to Nalo Hopkinson, an acquaintance I've known for many years. And her novel, Midnight Robber, I regard as one of the great science fiction novels ever. So, and there, at that point, I began to kind of run out of people that I've read enough to know what's going on. In fact, I think it's time actually to turn it around. Who are you reading? Because you're reading more and more widely. So who do you like?
Yeah, I definitely I read a lot. I teach a lot of I teach speculative fiction classes at some MFA programs actually, which is another example of how these kind of walls are starting to break down. I think that teaching writers like yourself and Ted Chiang and N.K. Jemisin, who I think has some utopian thinking in MFA programs 10 years ago might not happen, but now it does. But I do think the two I just named, I think Ted Chiang and N.K. Jemisin, at least some of their work could be called utopian. Definitely when I think of like a book that is trying to envision a future utopian society, it's the Culture series by Banks and Le Guin, who we've talked about, who come first to mind, in addition to yourself, of course.
So, did I read maybe online before this that you're teaching at Columbia?
I do teach there, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Not
Cool.
this semester, but some semesters, yeah.
And are these literature classes or writing classes or both?
Normally I teach a fiction seminar for graduate students, and I teach one on speculative fiction normally.
So, but you mean to say it's a literature class?
Yeah, well, it's for the MFA program, so we discuss the craft elements. But yeah, we're reading other people's work.
I see. And then, do you also teach writing workshops?
I've taught some at Sarah Lawrence College.
I see.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Cool. Well,
that adjunct life.
It's a good life. I mean, it frees you up for your own writing and helps to pay some bills. I taught intensively, mostly freshman composition, but every once in a while a fiction writing workshop and a science fiction literature class. It's a long time ago, really long time ago, but I kind of miss it, which my friends who teach regularly tell me I'm crazy to miss. But on the other hand, writing is a very solitary activity. And after a while, you can begin to feel like you've committed yourself to a minimum security prison, solitary confinement, and then you can try to fit in a social life around the side. But the work itself is amazingly solitary. It's a little crazy. So I missed my teaching because it's talking to people. It's talking about writing in books, which is really, as work goes, it's kind of falling off a log. It's what you would be doing anyway, and then you get paid for it. So I do miss it, and I'm wondering if who knows what will happen in my you might call retirement phase or slowed down phase. If I have time to do some teaching, I might. I'm not sure. This might just be a fantasy that, if enacted, would become a nightmare. I'm not sure. But I'm glad you're doing it, and to be doing it at Columbia. I just recently wandered into Columbia for the first time in my life. The people in the School of Architecture have been people I've worked with who are wonderful. In fact, they have basically a utopian architecture school going on there at Columbia that's super impressive. So, but I didn't know the campus was several uniform blocks of Upper West Side. I just had no idea. It's stunning how much that island holds in its nooks and crannies.
Yeah. Yeah. New York is one of those places, kind of, as you said, I don't know, it's like an endless place. There's so many, I'm just saying a cliche here, but there's a million New Yorks, right? And everywhere you go is somewhere kind of different. But okay, let me go back to the questions. And here's one that kind of relates to what we've been talking about in terms of utopia and dystopia. And Elisa says, hearing echoes of existentialism in this talk of hope versus hopelessness and cynicism in fiction, a la Sartre's Bad Faith. How much, if at all, does philosophy inform your fiction?
Well, thank you, Elisa, if that was who it was, for this question. I love it dearly. I was lucky. When I was an undergraduate, science fiction was something that you maybe did in the dark as a criminal activity kind of thing. But I was at UC San Diego, and I had a French professor named Fred Jameson. I had no idea who he was. And indeed, when he was my French professor, he wasn't who he is now, which is maybe the most famous literary critic in the world. But then he was just my French professor. I walked into his class and he said, well, what do you like to read? And I said, I like to read science fiction. I was very bold. And his eyes lit up and he said, me too. And he showed me Locus magazine, which at that time was a mimeographed, stapled together sheet of paper. And from then on, he was my advisor and welcomed my interest in science fiction in a way that in the academy at that time, it just wasn't happening. We're talking the early 70s here. So Jameson's subject was Sartre and existentialism. And in fact, I just recently listened to a class that he taught at Duke, a history of existentialism, beginning with Pascal, Kierkegaard, then up to Heidegger and Sartre and Camus, and forward into the present. And the pandemic struck right in the middle of it, so that he stopped and gave a little half-hour sermon, he called it, on what would be the existentialist attitude towards the pandemic. Well, it's the same as any other time in life. You still have to make it all up. So I would say that it's not so much my fiction where philosophy, all fiction is philosophical, okay? So they can't escape it. You can either be conscious with it or unconscious with it, but you're always expressing uh, basic or sophisticated philosophical positions. But in life in general, the existentialist position that um, that life has no meaning, that you have to make up the meaning of life, that it's a project-based experience, that you have to imagine your project and build your project and pay attention to other people. These existentialist maxims are really good guides to getting by in the world. They make more sense to me than any of the other religions or philosophical positions. So, yeah, I would say thank you for that question because it has been an important part of my life. And then that seeps into my fiction from the side.
I also love the existentialists. I think, maybe wanting to be an author is already fairly pretentious, but even when my even more pretentious younger days, I thought I would be a philosopher. And I initially thought I would study philosophy. And not that I know it super well, but yeah, I love the existentialists. I love a lot of those continental philosophers, and I still kind of dip into writers like Guy Debord and Kierkegaard and E.M. Ciron, and some of them. I mean, E.M. Ciron is like a brilliant stylist. Just if you just read that work as literature,
yeah.
This kind of relates to a question I had also written out to ask you, so maybe I can jump in too, which is one of the things I really love in your work, and is something I like hope to do in mine, is that I feel like you do a very great job of showing different ideological and political reactions to technology and changes. And obviously climate change is one, in your most recent book that lends itself to that. But in past books like, in Red Mars, where you have the various kind of factions that are fighting. And I'm curious how you get into different philosophies and ideologies, where presumably maybe you don't agree with all of them, but you do a very good job of fleshing them out and making them, showing their different points and sides.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, I'm very persuadable. So while I'm writing a character's point of view, I can convince myself it's the right one. I believe in my characters as often as I can. If that works well, that's really the point of the whole game, is to get out of the way of characters that aren't like me and have different beliefs from me and let them speak for themselves. That's a beautiful moment when it happens. It doesn't always happen. But then, since I'm so persuadable, a kind of when I'm working on a scene, I can see that people would take different attitudes toward it and then just write it from there. So it's a way of structuring fiction to make sure that you do have oppositions, but that both sides have their point of view. It's funny thinking about existentialism and what you said, Debord, the Society of the Spectacle. That kind of shows in this new novel of yours, because really you've got baseball as spectacle rather than a sport. It's all about the kind of winning, pumped up. It's gotten away from the origins of baseball into spectacle. And then you also have people, once you're 90% cyborg, are you still yourself? Which is another philosophical question that your protagonist has to struggle with, with his arm. Is it missing? And what does that mean for his own sense of wholeness? So these are indeed things that you're tumbling over in your plots also.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's hard not to get into a certain, or at least hard for me to not get into an existentialist kind of point of view for thinking about a character, right? Like, yeah, what is, I don't know, those, to me, they are kind of the essential questions, and you have to figure out also how you balance those into the larger societal questions. I remember I had a professor in undergrad who I took a class on him on Nietzsche, and he talked about that a lot, how you really need both the kind of societal question and the individual question if you're going to have a kind of whole understanding of thing. I also have this kind of weird philosophy that I think I incorrectly took from Kierkegaard. But I remember reading about how Kierkegaard has all these pseudonyms, and he kind of writes from these different points of view. And he has these pseudonyms that even, well, he has Climacus and Anticlimacus, right? Like literally opposites. And I think at one point I was like, maybe this is what I want fiction to do, is to present different sides of things. I missed the term here, right? Kierkegaard has this term of indirect communication. And I think that is maybe what I misunderstood, but I understood it to mean you can show people different facets of the crystal, of the theme or the question you're talking about. And that is kind of the power of art or thinking. And that is something I, like, in an ideal sense, would want to do in art and writing.
Yeah, it makes me think of the way that in fiction, what you would hope, and I know I skirt the edge of this very often, is to not look as if you're trying to persuade people of anything, that you get out of the way, like an usher. Say, these things happened. What do you think? And then clearly there's a kind of puppet mastering or backstage that you're guiding the action, you're loading the dice. Any reader is going to be able to unpack that as they ponder what the story told them. But really, one of the great pleasures, I think, of reading fiction is just getting away from the author's opinions into the characters and what they do in different situations. And so it's important to do that. And that, I think, is the Kierkegaard indirect communication, that you're trying to make a point indirectly by telling a story that has its own intrinsic interest beyond its messages. In fact, that's something that I'm beginning to think it needs pushing back against in fiction writing workshops in particular. There are secondary effects that you maybe shouldn't even worry about. Theme, for instance, that's an old one. World building, that's a new one. These are secondary effects. The primary effects are character and plot paths. I worry that it's becoming commonplace these days to talk about things that writers probably shouldn't even concern themselves with. This is it's a reader's approach to writing rather than a writer's approach to writing, which is fine if you're in a class about reading. But if you're in a class about writing, I wonder if people are having blockages to their own sense of inventiveness by a workshop vocabulary. And I come from the workshop system, but I have a lot of objections to it, a lot of reservations about it. What about you? Did you do writing workshops? I mean, how did you come to your craft?
I did. I got an MFA at Columbia, so that's how. I mean, I didn't start teaching there for a decade later, but that's how I came to New York. I grew up in Virginia, in Central Virginia, but I did come through that. I think I had a good time in my MFA program, and I learned a lot. I think I always had a somewhat outsider perspective in that I was reading stuff like that was not in vogue perhaps in the workshops. I was obviously reading science fiction. I was reading a lot of horror on the kind of literary side without getting into that distinction too much. I loved Italo Calvino and Kobo Abe and Franz Kafka, writers who people like, but isn't what like normally is turned into a workshop where you have a, mostly a realist kind of setting, and you have a second page flashback and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think the more you can resist those formulas, the better your work will be. And I do think when you bring up world building, that seems like one that my students are increasingly concerned with in a way that I do wonder if it blocks their writing, or you're losing the flow of the story and the emotion, the effects and the atmosphere you want to create to try to get all these details and names in or something.
Yeah, I think world building is indeed a kind of category error. And you're not an art director. You're not building a little model set. You're telling a story, and the focus has to stay on that one way or another. So were there, this Columbia MFA program, were there writers who were mentor figures? There were teachers there at the time for you?
A little bit. I never got into the kind of mentor relationship with someone where we stayed in touch too much after the program. But, I will say that it was despite my kind of misgivings about some of the workshop stuff, which I don't think was specific to Columbia at all, it was a program that was much more on the forefront of kicking down some of these literary genre barriers. So when I was there, Kelly Link taught a class, which I was not able to take, but it was at the time. And soon Victor Laval, I think, was like a writer in residence there. And now he runs the fiction program. So he's the one who hires me when we do that, but he's obviously a very genre-friendly guy. And so even though the students were maybe not writing that, it was a bit more in the air. And when I was there, Ben Marcus was running the program, who is, a very experimental writer who's doing, pushing the limits of language and form. So that atmosphere is there.
Well, I think that shows in your work. That's a good education in cutting edge. I should have mentioned writers that I've read. Kelly Link, I've read all of. It's not a gigantic number of stories, and I'm looking forward to her novel that she's working on. But her stories are simply amazing, and they are like perhaps beyond teaching. They work like dreams, but dreams are not fiction, and her stories are fiction. So there's something very tricky and brilliant going on in Kelly Link stories that even if you can't imitate it, you can enjoy it as a reader. They're beautiful stories. And a lot of these people that we're talking about are, and I am graduates of the Clarion Science Fiction Writing Workshop, which is a summer program currently at UC San Diego. Well, I have ambivalent feelings about it, but I am a graduate. I've taught it a couple times, not very happily. Because it happens in the summer and I'd rather be in the mountains. But to see all these people coming out of Clarion, there must be something going right there. Or maybe it's just a sign that ambitious people go there just in case it happens to help them, which is maybe what, like you going to Columbia. I mean, MFA programs are notorious for being unhelpful. But the thing is that what else are you going to study if you want to be a writer? So you give it a try anyway. And then for people who were going to succeed, whether or not they joined one of these courses, then they're going to succeed. And so then it looks like the course had something to do with it, when maybe I think it's always just your own reading, your own thinking, your own writing in a feedback loop. And your own reading is really important to that feedback loop. Discussion with other people, sometimes that is just like clarifying for yourself how little you agree with them. And on you go.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, it always comes down to your own reading, right? That's always going to be the greatest teacher. I think that for me, the MFA program was useful especially in the sense, well, it got me to New York, which was just good for me, a good place to be. But also it was a time and space in which everyone, and I think this is the same with like Clarion, everyone is taking writing very seriously. I grew up in Central Virginia, and I wasn't hanging out with a lot of writers. I didn't know them. It wasn't something I could be like, oh, I could tell someone I was writing experimental horror stories or something, but they're just like, okay. So being around people who took it very seriously, that the atmosphere helps a lot, but maybe more than like literal lessons that you learn or something.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, essentially, you're paying for and working for time when you're free to write, and you're around other people. You can bounce off ideas, conversations at night, conversations with other students, also a wide variety of teachers. All the workshops have that advantage. So I can see how that might work. So Central Virginia, that's like Bill Gibson territory. Well, maybe he's from Western Virginia.
I'm not sure where he's from. I grew up initially in a kind of rural area outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, which used to be a town that no one knew, and now is the town that everyone knows for like the worst thing possible, Nazis marching down our street. But
yeah. Well, I don't know. I spent 4 years in Washington, D.C. That's the closest I've ever come to that part of the territory. But it sure was hot and muggy in the summers. That's one thing I'll say with fervor. I grew up in a beach town, or behind the beach in Orange County, California. There was no theater. It was the 50s and 60s. It was a cultural wasteland, a kind of a suburb of Los Angeles, being interested in books was just a very peculiar thing, but I liked that. It was a private world. It was a kind of bubble I lived in with all of these writers that I was reading. And at that point, I don't think you need to have discussions or teachers. It's really a personal activity, which is one of the things I love about it.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I wouldn't say that, I had friends who were readers and stuff, but it felt very private. I don't think I read anything with none of my friends read too. We didn't sit around and both read, or a bunch of us read whatever I was reading, Calvino and Le Guin and writers like that, and then discuss them. It was a very private activity. I think that, it was very important.
I'm a lover of Calvino myself, and I must say his collected works in English, again, it's not huge on the shelf, but he did everything. There are really kind of, what would you call it, neo-realism, like the Italian movies of the 50s. He has a few stories that are completely realistic, and then he has all of his wild stories, and he was so interesting, elegant, funny. It's beautiful writing. And yeah, Calvino is again, like Kelly Ling, easy to love, hard to learn lessons from, at least for me.
Yeah, although I do remember especially when I was first reading Calvino, one of the things I was like, that is what I want to do as a writer, was not his style, but what you're mentioning about his ability to cross genres, basically, if we want to put it that way. He does realist work. He does experimental language stuff. He does fabulous stories that are kind of like folk tales. I love that. When I was reading him in high school, I would love to write a horror book and then write a fantasy book. I would love to be able to do every one.
And you've been doing that.
Well, I guess some of my stories cross that around for sure.
Yeah. Well, the short story in FNSF is a folk story, a ghost story. You mentioned Shirley Jackson in your intro. It's that, I mean, that's a genre, the haunted village, very American, very needs to be done. But then on the other hand, your novel is nothing like that. It's very much in the realm of the satiric science fiction exaggeration of a current moment type surrealism. You could talk about Vonnegut or Pohl, and I think it's Jonathan Lethem who mentioned Pohl and Kornbluth. And my teacher Damon Knight, who started Clarion and started Science Fiction Writers of America, he wasn't as much like that, except maybe he was in the early 50s. But you know what I mean. You're trying to, every idea leads you into a different tradition, but you've done enough reading that you have a grasp, just enough of a grasp of that tradition that you are able to propel your own stories, into their own spaces without accidentally reinventing the wheel or doing something that you see with, occasional story submissions to Clarion where people aren't aware. So I do think, yeah, being a big reader, it's so much of a help as a writer.
Yeah, and I want to check in on the time here because I know you have a hard stop. Are we hitting that now?
We are a couple minutes away from my hard stop. Thank you for reminding me, Lordy. Good thing computers have clocks that you can trust.
So should you want to answer one more question, or should we end it here?
Oh, I can do one more. Yes, I have not yet been kicked out. Yeah, let's go a little longer.
Okay. So here's one for you from the chat from Erica. She asks for KSR. I appreciate that you don't pit religion against science like some authors have. How do you avoid that, or what might be the role of religion in the face of climate change, do you think?
Well, these are good questions. Thank you. When I wrote about Galileo, I began to understand better than ever that you can regard science as a kind of a devotional exercise. So that finesses the problem. If you think to yourself that religion, a sense that the universe is sacred, that's fine. What do you do as a way of worshiping it? Well, you study the heck out of it. So science is a form of religious practice. That works for Buddhism too, and I've written about that as well. So I don't have any problems with that reconciliation. And I found it interesting that Galileo almost got himself burned at the stake for insisting that he was a good Catholic, despite his various scientific speculations. And then for climate change, I have been wondering, and it's in Ministry for the Future, if some kind of really ancient religion that the earth is our sacred home, it's our body, our extended body, it's our mother figure. Without wanting to get too gendered about it, it's easy to get feeling towards the maternal when you think about the life-giving properties of the biosphere. So a kind of biosphere religion, and it wouldn't be new. It would really be maybe the oldest, like even older than humanity. In other words, we evolved into being humans with that mindset already in our heads of the wow, we're wandering in a sacred space. So with that, I really am hitting my hard stop here. So maybe sorry to go on at length about that, but it's a provocative question, and maybe we can all go out and let's have a devotional exercise. I think a little Dionysian activity is important in this time. Go have fun. Let's have a drink. Yours is a baseball novel. I'll end with this. I love that. And may the Mets do well because I hate the Yankees. But I have to go from here to a softball game, my first softball game in a year and a half. I'm scared out of my mind. I'm like an 8-year-old, like first time at bat ever. And so, damn, this has been fun, and like more fun than my next hour is going to be because I'm going to be shaking in my cleats. But it'll be fun.
Well, I hope you knock one out of the park, and thank you so much for talking to me. It's really been an extreme honor for me.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lincoln, and good luck. Congratulations and good luck with it. I'll be looking forward to meeting in person. And thanks to Orbit, our mutual super publisher. Couldn't be in better hands. I have to say that after a long career, you're starting at the best.
Awesome.
It's good.
Well, that seems like the perfect place to end. I think we're just waiting for someone to hit the stop button.
In fact, our waving our hands was the signal to our wonderful keeper Ellen.